Hello, my name is Daniel Schmachtenberger. I'm the founder of a research project called Strategic Global Solutions that was started in early 2007, primarily aimed at answering the question, if we care about dolphins and whales and the health of the oceans and the welfare of people in Africa and children all around the world and education and healthcare reform and all of it, excluding nothing, and recognize the problems in all these areas as inextricably interconnected. And our deepest desire is to support the evolution of a global system that supports and makes possible the highest quality of life for all life, now and evolvingly. How do we get from here to there as effectively and efficiently and quickly as possible as one integrated project factoring everything? And that really appealed to us as a meta imperative for our species, and that for all evolutionarily minded, omni-inclusive value humans, this is really our goal. How do we organize our activity as a species towards the evolution of the most effective, viable, fulfilling world system for all? And in order to answer that question, how do we get from here to there as effectively as possible, we recognize that understanding the data points of here and there very well were a first critical starting place. And so when we look at what the data point of here is, we started to inventory what are all of the areas of need, what are all the areas of global problems, and this is all the problems in education and in agriculture and in species extinction and in fundamental flaws of economics and governance structures and all of that, to really be able to deeply inventory what are all the areas that need resource allocated to them. And we find that we have three primary areas we look at. What are the areas of human and environmental need that are already being met to some level, and we want to make sure that they continue to be met at that level or higher as we work with other things. What are existent problems that need remediated, and then the development of new technologies and systems that can meet needs at a higher level. And we found that there was no centralized inventory of what we as a species really need to do to make life on this planet viable for everybody. The UN didn't have it, none of the organizations did, and there were a bunch of parts of it in different places. And as much as many of us might have romanticized about if we had the power to really make changes in the world, what we'd like to do, we realized that if we were in that position, that we were profoundly underinformed to actually know what needs done, in what time scales, how to allocate resource to all of that, and what the most effective ways to go are. And that this was clearly information that we needed to develop in great detail to be able to have that power. And so as we were inventorying problems, or what you could call more generally areas that need resource allocated to them, we saw that we needed to develop the right kinds of metrics to be able to compare all these issues. And so we looked at metrics like what the scope of any particular issue was, how much human life was affected by this issue directly and indirectly, where we specified what direct and indirect means, how much non-human life is affected directly and indirectly, what the magnitude of that effect is, which means how much quality of life is affected. We need to look at urgency, which is what are the time scales in which these issues have to be addressed, that if certain benchmarks aren't reached, then critical mass points of irreversible harm occur, so that we know the timelines in which we have to address these things. How are all the different problems interconnected? So this particular problem feeds into all these other ones. So we can see that agriculture and soil issues feed into water table issues, for instance, and that these issues are also fed into by everything from economic issues to issues with pesticides and genetically modified processes and all these things. So for any issue, what are all the areas that feed into it? What are all the areas that feed out of it? So that as we're looking at resource allocation, we can start to look at the complexity of the interaction of how we address something, making sure that it doesn't externalize harm to other areas inadvertently, and that we maximize the externalization of positives to other areas, and that we can see how, as we work on any part of it, how that affects the systemic overall evolution of the whole, which is really our goal. And then we also look at the etiology of each of these issues, how those issues came into being, and what the political components are, and the economic vested interest components, and the technological components, and the social value system components, and all the levels of cause and effect that have to be addressed for an issue to really be fundamentally resolved. And so when we address all the levels of cause and effect, and we address all the interconnection, then we really are looking at fundamentally viable solutions. And one of the reasons we got into this was because of a background in many different areas of activism, and seeing how much problems were mostly just moved because they didn't address all the levels of cause and effect and all the interconnections, and how much well-intentioned activism that doesn't have a deep enough understanding of the problems, how they all interconnect, and a deep enough strategy involved to really be truly effective. And we want to make sure that all good-intentioned, heartfelt action is backed by the most intelligent strategy to really produce the best results, which is, all of our goal. And so all of these metrics for what we can call the problems end up serving as a basis for being able to evaluate most effective strategies and best practices, which then we also start to inventory. What are all of the solutions to be able to address each of these problems? What are all the solutions that have been proposed so far? And how to be able to look at the input to output ratios for all these solutions, how much resource it takes to do a particular solution, for how much measurable change comes out of it, and measurable change in that local area of concern, and measurable change globally when we factor how it interaffects everything else. And so our goal then is to be able to have the most effective strategies in their particular area, and the strategies that have the most effective overall impact, and look at how strategies in different sectors interaffect each other symbiotically to have strategy guilds. And so we're inventorying the problems, inventorying the strategies, also then inventorying what are the physical resources that we have to work with on this planet. And this is looking at things like the reusability of waste streams, what we currently call waste, with our current and the developing technologies available, as well as the things traditionally called resource, because we need to know what we have to work with resource-wise, what we have to work with strategy-wise, which is what converts resources into meeting needs and what the needs are. And all of this together informs also an awareness of what the sustainable carrying capacity for our planet is, which right now is guessed at best, and the guess is very hugely from a population much less than what we currently have to more than what we currently have. This is a very important thing that we need to know as we move forward. And obviously the carrying capacity is not a fixed number, but is a range that's based on how efficient the technologies are for moving resources into met needs, how high a quality of life is being met, and it's several factors. So this is all part of the project that we're working on. So the next data point is getting clear on the there, which is where are we going? Where do we want to be going? And in activism and in governance so far, oftentimes we are moving away from problems we're in reaction to, but without a very clear awareness of what a truly functional model would look like. And so we started asking questions like, if we were going to redesign human society and human civilization from the ground up today, without assuming that any of the ways that we have done things so far are necessarily the best ways to proceed, they might possibly be, but really being able to inventory, starting with the best of everything we know of science and technology and all like that today, what the best ways of meeting human needs in conjunction with the environment harmoniously would be. How would we design civilization? What would education look like? And what would transportation look like if we weren't trying to retrofit maybe a fundamentally flawed system, but we're designing it starting from scratch, starting with the best of everything that we know now, and with the modularity and evolvability to be able to evolve as quickly as possible with the input of new, better strategies. And so that we could really develop a blueprint, and of course an ever-evolving blueprint that gets to synthesize the best of information from all sources of where we are wanting to move. And so our approach has looked like this. With regard to governance models, for instance, and governance in the most general sense means how we collectively make decisions about what it is that we need to do and how to best go about doing it. And governance in general is different than government, which is a particular structure of how we do it. The biggest overall subjects that we're looking at here is a new structure of how we collectively make decisions about what we need to do and how we best to do it, which is a new system of governance that is necessarily global because of fundamentally almost all of our issues, pollution and war and trade and all like this, are global issues. And a new system of economics that in its deepest sense means a basis for how we allocate planetary resources towards which value system. Are we allocating them to maximize differential advantage of a few over many, or are we working to allocate them in a manner that scientifically optimizes the possibility for quality of life for all life? And so with regard to governance systems, we start by looking at all the governance systems that have been attempted so far in a really philosophically uninvested and scientifically critical way to look at what the effective and the ineffective parts of each of these have been. What are the really effective parts of capitalism that involve things like maximizing motive to the individual, and then what are the dysfunctional parts of it, which is some of the pathological kinds of competition and externalization of harm and like that occurs, and what are the functional parts of communism and those systems that we're recognizing that people are affected by the whole, and we need to make sure that we're taking care of the whole. And then what were some of the dysfunctional parts, like having individual human motive not be maximized by those systems, and how can we work to take the functional parts of all the systems that we've tried so far based on a good analysis of the metrics that are involved, divested of the dysfunctional parts, and synthesize the functional parts of everything that humanity has learned so far to a best of what we know on this topic, for instance, governance. And then also to look at what we know about regulatory systems and control systems from other systems like cybernetics and computer science and regulation of information flow systems. And when we look at nature and we look at how an ecosystem governs, which is more of a kind of a bottom-up emergent governance than a top-down imposed governance, but where there's so many moving parts that have an immaculate kind of balance, what's the operating system? What are the governance principles that are there? And so we have kind of a biomimicry for social design. And all of this is speaking to how to apply the scientific method and all the methodologies of science, which is an opinion divested, fact-based decision-making system, to social design and to societal design. And this is what Carl Sagan and Buckminster Fuller and Jacques Fresco and many have talked about as being fundamentally necessary for a long time. There's not really a Republican versus a Democrat or a capitalist versus a communist way of cleaning dirty water or bringing water to people that need it. There's more and less effective ways of doing that in terms of input of resource to output of what our desired output is. And so how do we have a governance system that is as opinion divested as possible, as fact-based as possible, as omni-inclusive in the goal of what it is that we're working on as possible, and so this is really what we're looking at. And obviously then the question is, what really is the goal? What do we call quality of life? And this is a very deep topic that we also look at when we're talking about maximizing the possibility for quality of life for all life. What are the metrics that we're looking to optimize? Because we know that GDP is not a good metric, and that GDP per capita is not a good metric if we're really looking at individual happiness and interpersonal happiness and sustainability with the planet. And so the goal is to be able to look at all of the different possible relevant metrics, how they interaffect each other, and bring them into an integral picture that's able to factor all of that and continuously factor new variables and metrics, so it's an elastically updatable system to give us the most comprehensive basis of what we're seeking to optimize. So we want to look at, when we're looking at maximizing quality of life, we want to look at subjective metrics, people's reporting of their own happiness and all the different dimensions of life, which is their happiness and their sense of creativity and contribution and personal relationships and all like that. And we also want to look at objective metrics, which is we can look at things like suicide rate and mental illness rate and crime rate and all the different things that look at both how functional the system is from the point of view of individuals, from the point of view of how individuals interact, from the point of view of how whole societies and communities interact with each other, and how they interact with the ecosystem and sustainability. And then we also look at factors involving time. Do we want people that are happy now and not really motivated to evolve, or people that are evolving motivated by discontent? And obviously we care about both happiness now and evolution into ever higher possibilities of happiness and the expression of human potential. So how do we maximize both of these simultaneously? And how do we answer all of this in a collective way that pulls the best of everything that we know, that's empirically founded, that's opinion divested, and where we don't know for sure, how do we set up social experiments to really be able to determine these things as best as possible and feed back and forth the ground up social experiments to a centralized database of knowledge regarding these topics? So critical path analysis is looking at how we get from here to there for any particular here and there, factoring many variables in a complex system. And we look at which things can happen simultaneously, independent of each other, which things have to happen subsequently because they depend upon the results of a previous set of action, and how do we allocate the total amount of resources we have to each area in light of how that maximizes the systemic movement, and what are the best practices and best strategies for the utilization of that resource in each area. And all this comes together to do critical path. Now, when we're looking at the critical path for humanity's success, it's a dynamic critical path because the here point is continuously changing as our global problems and global needs change, and this can happen in unpredicted ways all the time. A new earthquake occurs, and now we need to be able to look at, resource needs allocated to dealing with that, and that means resources being taken from somewhere else, and yet we still have all of our comprehensive goals. How do we really optimize that process? So we have a continuously changing here point and a continuously changing there point as new technologies emerge and new social understandings emerge to what the best of what's possible for societal design keeps changing. And so how do we elastically upgrade and update our critical path with the input of all new relevant information to where we know what we need to be doing now that is most effective towards the most long-range goals and all of our timely goals, and that what we're doing now is continuously optimized in light of the input of all new real information. And so this requires a lot of complexity factoring. And so this is another thing that we've looked at, which is how do we see how a particular problem relates to problems in other areas in potentially unanticipated ways when we only take a specialist approach, and how does a particular solution there end up affecting other areas, because we can see sometimes in solving a particular problem in a particular way we can actually externalize harm to another area unanticipatedly, like for instance when we were working to get off of foreign oil by creating biofuels, but in the process creating biofuels from agricultural sources that created environmental damage. We want to be able to make sure that as we're solving a particular problem, we're not externalizing that harm somewhere else. So this requires a cross-sectoral analysis. And to have a functional cross-sectoral analysis, we make sure that we're looking at all the other sectors appropriately. We need to know what all the sectors are. This requires a taxonomy of all of the issues that we're looking at and how they all interrelate to each other. And then how our goal is to be able to have solutions that are both optimized for their particular area of focus and optimized for the systemic benefit when we factor all of the externalized positives and negatives. And this overall, factoring all of our current problems and areas of need, and the timelines and the interconnections and the scope and the magnitude on all of that, factoring all the resources we have to work with, factoring all the potential strategies and the way of synthesizing those strategies and how those strategies interact each other, and looking at where we're wanting to go and what about that we know and is clear, what about that is not yet clear that needs refinement and experimentation. to really be able to know where we want to go in light of the most comprehensive kinds of metrics of what quality of life really means, and being able to optimize how we get from here to there continuously, recognizing there's no fixed there point. It's a continuously evolving, progressive there. This whole process of how we collectively make decisions and how we collectively allocate resource in a scientifically optimized way creates the basis for a planetary operating system and a new system of global governance and economics, which is how do we, as a conscious species, recognizing that we're profoundly interconnected, that all of our needs, that all of our problems, that all of our welfare is profoundly interconnected, not just with other humans in our area, but with all other humans and with all other species, and not just now, but ongoingly. Recognizing that, how do we organize all of our efforts and intentions and endeavors in specific areas in light of a whole meta-endeavor in an optimized way? And this really is what appeals to us as not another project amongst the many projects, but an organizational system that can potentiate and maximize the efficiency of and the interconnected strategy between all projects, all positive endeavors that need to be happening. And that's ultimately what our goal is here, is a meta system for global governance and organization of all evolutionary human activity. In the broadest sense, the direction of evolution is ordering complexity, higher orders of complexity, which is two things. It's more parts that are involved, more complexity, and ordering that. If we get a more complex system without adequate order, we end up just getting more entropy and it degrades to the last level. And so if we look at a cell has all of the complexity of the component molecules that make it up, but they're arranged in a particular way that if we just had all of the molecules that make up a cell thrown in a petri dish, it wouldn't be a cell, it would just be a heap of molecules, it wouldn't be that interesting. When you arrange it, when you order it, that togetherness is what allows the cell to respirate and to replicate, even though none of the parts on their own do that. And those emergent properties come from ordering the parts into a whole. And we can look at the same way in terms of a nervous system, and no neuron by itself thinks or feels. It has a particular firing pattern, but when you order the firing pattern of all those neurons together in the way that a human brain and nervous system works, you get sentience and you get I-ness and consciousness. Well, in the same way, we have, as all of the many neurons are connected in our brain to create human consciousness, and all of the cells are connected in a particular pattern to create a human organism, we have all of these cells of human beings on this planet that, when they're not ordered, is basically just like a whole bunch of cells separately, which is not that interesting. But when their activities are ordered together in light of a higher order, then humanity as an organism of sorts actually gets to emerge, and there are emergent properties that get to arise from that. And what we're looking at creating here with this global operating system is kind of a network for being able to take the database inside of each human and be able to take what everybody knows, to be able to vet it and synthesize it into a collected database that is ever evolving of the best of what humanity knows about everything so far, that is both able to be fed into by all people and fed out the relevant parts to all people for maximizing our collective engagement, organization, and activity. And so rather than just being a bunch of separate neurons, there's actually a nervous system and a consciousness. Rather than just being a bunch of separate human individuals, there's actually humanity as not just a concept, but really a functional entity.